The first plasma bolt screamed past Captain Sarah Chun's head, close enough that she could smell the ozone it left behind. She pressed herself against the twisted metal of what had once been a supply depot on Kepler 442b. Her pulse rifle clutched tight against her chest. Around her, the remnants of the 3rd Colonial Defense Force were dying. "Captain!" Sergeant Martinez crawled through the rubble, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Blood seeped through his tactical armor. "We've lost contact with all other units. The Vorthak have overrun the entire eastern sector." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sounds of her people screaming in the distance. 3 years. 3 years since the Vorthak Collective had descended from the void like a plague of locusts, consuming world after world with methodical precision. Earth's colonies had fallen one by one, and now humanity was down to its last dozen worlds. The Vorthak weren't just conquerors. They were artists of suffering. Sarah had seen the recordings from New Geneva, watched as they systematically harvested the population, keeping humans alive for weeks as they slowly extracted everything useful from their bodies. The lucky ones died quickly. The rest became fuel for Vorthak bioships or components in their living weapons. "How many of us are left?" Sarah asked, checking her ammunition counter. 12 shots remaining. Maybe 40 spread across the colony. The civilian evacuation shuttles never made it off the ground. The Vorthak hit them first. Martinez's voice cracked. "Captain, my daughter was on Transport 7. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Transport 7 had been carrying 300 children to the orbital station. She'd watched it explode from her position on the ridge. A brief flower of fire against the alien sky, the ground shook as something massive moved nearby. Through a gap in the debris, Sarah caught a glimpse of a Vorthak harvester, a writhing mass of biomechanical horror that stood 3 stories tall. Its tentacles moved with obscene grace as it sorted through the wreckage of the colony searching for survivors. She could hear it singing in harmonics that made her teeth ache, a sound like whale song filtered through a meat grinder. "They're not even angry," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Martinez. "That's what makes this so much worse. They're not conquering us out of hatred or fear or greed. We're just resources to them, like cattle." Martinez nodded grimly. "Command says the fleets at Ross 128 and Proxima Centauri fell last week. Admiral Harrison transmitted his final orders before the Vorthak swarmed his flagship." He pulled a data chip from his belt. "Project Lazarus has been authorized." Sarah stared at the chip like it was a venomous snake. "That's impossible. The Ethics Committee would never approve it. The UN Security Council, the Colonial Senate, they all voted it down, unanimously." "Desperate times," Martinez said. "The vote was overturned by emergency powers. Dr. Yates is already at the facility on Titan, waiting for final authorization codes." He handed her the chip, the captain's authorization codes. Sarah's hand trembled as she took the device. Project Lazarus. She'd read the classified files, attended the briefings where pale-faced scientists explained what they'd discovered in the deep archives of human genetic data, what they'd found sleeping in the unused portions of human DNA. Locked away by millions of years of evolution, the Vorthak had made one crucial error in their invasion of human space. They'd studied human technology, human tactics, human weaknesses, but they'd never bothered to study human history. They didn't understand that beneath the veneer of civilization, humanity carried something far older and more terrible than any alien weapon. "The preliminary tests were promising," Martinez continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The subjects showed increased aggression, enhanced physical capabilities, complete loss of fear response. But the psychological effects... I know." Sarah had seen the footage from the test site on Europa. The volunteers had torn apart a Vorthak prisoner with their bare hands, then turned on each other when nothing else remained to kill. It had taken a full platoon with heavy weapons to put them down. "We'd be unleashing monsters." "Monsters that hate the Vorthak more than anything else in the universe," Martinez corrected. Dr. Yates called it weaponized human malice. The genetic triggers respond to Vorthak pheromones. Vorthak biosignatures? They'll tear through the enemy like paper, but they'll leave human populations mostly alone. Mostly. Sarah noticed he didn't say completely. The harvester's song grew louder, closer. Sarah could see its shadow moving across the rubble field. In another few minutes, it would find their hiding spot, and that would be the end. Another few drops in the ocean of human suffering the Vorthak had created. She thought about her sister's family, on New Shanghai, probably already dead or worse. She thought about the children on Transport 7, their brief lives snuffed out for the crime of being born human in a galaxy that had no place for weakness. She thought about the billions who had already died and the billions more who would follow if nothing changed. The activation codes require 2 senior officers, Martinez said quietly. I've already input mine. Sarah looked at the data chip again. Such a small thing to hold the future of the human race. Or its damnation. The scientists weren't even sure the process could be reversed once it started. They might be trading one extinction for another, one kind of monster for something even worse, but at least it would be their choice. Their monsters killing their enemies, the Vorthak harvester rounded the corner, its biomechanical sensors sweeping across the debris field. Sarah could see smaller Vorthak warriors clinging to its surface, their chitinous bodies gleaming weightly in the alien sun. They moved with the confidence of apex. Predators who had never encountered anything that could threaten them. That was about to change. Sarah slotted the chip into her command console and placed her palm on the biometric scanner. The device hummed for a moment, processing her genetic signature, her retinal pattern, the unique electrical field of her brain. Then it chimed softly. Authorization confirmed, the synthetic voice announced. Project Lazarus is now active. Transmission to Titan facility commencing. Somewhere in the solar system, Dr. Yates would be receiving the signal. Soon, the first volunteers would be stepping into the gene modification chambers. Within hours, the new human prototypes would be ready for deployment. Within days, they would spread across the galaxy like a plague of vengeance. The Vorthak had wanted to harvest humanity. Instead, they were about to reap the whirlwind. Dr. Elena Yates stood before the massive gene modification chamber, her hands shaking despite years of surgical training. The facility deep beneath Titan's frozen surface hummed with barely contained energy, banks of quantum computers processing genetic data at speeds that would have been impossible just decades ago. But what they were about to do had never been attempted on this scale. Final systems check complete, announced Dr. Park from his monitoring station. All bio-containment fields are active. Neural dampening systems are online. He paused, his voice tight with worry. Elena, are you absolutely certain about this? Once we activate the primary sequence, there's no going back. Elena looked at the volunteer lying unconscious in the chamber. James Morrison, former colonial marine, had lost his entire family when the Vorthak hit Gliese 667C, like the other 39 volunteers. He'd signed up for Project Lazarus knowing full well he might not survive the process. Or worse, that he might survive it and become something that was no longer recognizably human. The genetic modifications weren't simple. Elena and her team had spent years unlocking the dormant sequences buried deep in human DNA, evolutionary dead ends that had been suppressed when early humans developed complex social structures. Berserker genes, some called them. The capacity for absolute, unthinking violence that had allowed humanity's ancestors to survive in a hostile world. But they'd done more than just unlock ancient savagery. They'd enhanced it, amplified it, given it direction. The new genetic sequences would rewrite a subject's neural pathways, flooding their system with modified hormones and neurotransmitters that would make them faster, stronger, and utterly without fear. More importantly, they'd respond to Vorthak biosignatures with overwhelming aggressive impulses. Activation codes received and confirmed, called out Dr. Singh from the communications array. Captain Chun and Sergeant Martinez have given final authorization. Project Lazarus is cleared for immediate deployment. Elena took a deep breath and placed her hand on the activation console. Through the reinforced glass, she could see Morrison's peaceful face. In a few hours, if the process worked, he would wake up as something new. Something terrible. Something that might be humanity's only hope. God forgive us, she whispered, and pressed the activation button. The chamber filled with a soft blue light as billions of nanobots began rewriting Morrison's genetic structure at the cellular level. His body convulsed once, then went still as the neural dampening field kept him unconscious. On the monitoring screens, Elena watched his vital signs spike and fluctuate as the modifications took hold. "Neural activity is off the charts," reported Dr. Park. "His brain is literally rewiring itself. Increased density in the amygdala, massive growth in the motor cortex. Jesus, look at these muscle fiber changes. He's gaining 30% more fast-twitch muscle mass. Hormone production is through the roof," added Dr. Singh. "Testosterone, adrenaline, noradrenaline, plus the synthetic compounds we introduced. His pain tolerance will be nearly non-existent, but so will his capacity for complex emotional processing." Elena nodded grimly. They weren't just creating super soldiers. They were creating living weapons that happened to be housed in human bodies. The psychological profiles predicted complete suppression of empathy, fear, and higher reasoning during combat situations. Morrison would retain his memories and basic personality, but when he encountered Vorthic forces, he would become something primal and unstoppable. "How long until the others are ready?" Elena asked. "Chamber 2 will be complete in 6 hours, Chamber 3 in 12. The accelerated processing takes time, but we can have all 40 volunteers modified within 72 hours. Dr. Park wiped sweat from his forehead despite the facility's cool temperature. "Elena, I have to ask again. Are we sure about the targeting protocols? The genetic triggers are designed to respond to Vorthak pheromones and bioelectrical signatures. But what if there are other alien species out there that trigger the same responses?" It was a question that had haunted Elena for months. The targeting wasn't perfect. The modified humans would remain relatively stable around normal human populations, but any sufficiently alien biosignature might set them off. They were creating a weapon that could turn on their own allies if they ever encountered friendly alien species, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, the Vorthic were systematically exterminating every human world they could find, and conventional weapons had proven utterly inadequate. The chamber's blue light began to fade, and Morrison's vital signs stabilized. Elena held her breath as the bio-monitoring systems ran their final checks. Brain activity was showing the expected patterns. Muscle density had increased dramatically. Hormone levels were stabilizing at the new, dramatically elevated baseline. "Modification complete," announced the chamber's AI. "Subject is ready for revival." Elena walked to the chamber's control panel and initiated the wake-up sequence. Morrison's eyes snapped open immediately, none of the grogginess typical of someone emerging from anesthesia. He sat up with fluid, predatory grace that made Elena take an involuntary step backward. "How do you feel, James?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Morrison turned to look at her, and Elena felt her blood freeze. His eyes were the same brown they'd always been, but there was something different in them now. Something cold and patient and utterly without mercy. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly calm, almost conversational. "I feel focused, Doctor. Very focused." He flexed his hands experimentally, watching his fingers move with what seemed like fascination. "When do we deploy?" "Soon," Elena replied. "We need to run some final tests first. Make sure the targeting protocols are working properly." As if summoned by her words, Dr. Singh activated a small bioprojector that filled the air with synthetic Vorthic pheromones. The effect on Morrison was immediate and terrifying. His pupils dilated to pinpoints, his muscles tensed like coiled springs, and a sound emerged from his throat that was somewhere between a growl and a scream of pure rage. He launched himself at the projector with inhuman speed, his hands reaching for it like claws. Only the reinforced glass of the chamber kept him from tearing the device apart. Even through the barrier, Elena could feel the raw violence radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Shut it off," she shouted, and Dr. Singh quickly deactivated the pheromone projector. Morrison immediately relaxed, stepping back from the glass with that same fluid grace. The rage vanished from his eyes as if it had never been there, replaced by calm curiosity. "Interesting," he said mildly. "I remember wanting to destroy something, but I can't quite recall what." He looked at Elena with what might have been amusement. "I take it the modifications are working as intended?" Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. In 30 seconds, she'd watched Morrison transform from a perfectly normal human being into a killing machine and back again. The genetic triggers were working better than her wildest projections. "Doctor?" Dr. Park called from his station, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "We're receiving reports from the front lines. The Vorthak have begun their final assault on Ross 128. Admiral Reeves is requesting immediate deployment of any available Lazarus units." Elena looked at Morrison through the chamber glass. He was doing simple exercises now, testing his enhanced strength and reflexes with the detached interest of a scientist examining a new piece of equipment. He seemed completely unaware of the horror he'd just displayed. "1 unit," she decided. "We deploy Morrison to Ross 128 as soon as the transport can be arranged. Consider it a field test." "Elena," Dr. Park protested, "we haven't completed the full psychological evaluation. We don't know how he'll interact with normal human troops." "We don't have time for full evaluations," Elena replied sharply. "The Vorthak aren't going to wait for us to perfect the process. Morrison goes to Ross 128. If he performs as expected, we'll accelerate production of the remaining units." She turned back to Morrison, who was now standing perfectly still, apparently listening to sounds only he could hear. His head was cocked slightly to one side, like a predator catching the scent of prey. "James, can you hear me?" "Of course, Doctor." Morrison smiled, and for a moment he looked almost like the man he'd been before the modifications, almost. "I was just thinking about the Vorthak, about what they did to my family, about what I'm going to do to them in return." The smile never reached his eyes. The transport ship Retribution dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Ross 128 system to a scene of absolute carnage. Admiral Reeves watched from the bridge as his tactical display lit up with the signatures of dying human ships. The Vorthak fleet hung in space like a cluster of malignant tumors, their bioships pulsing with alien life as they methodically dismantled the last organized resistance in the sector. "Sir," reported Commander Walsh from the communications station, "we're receiving scattered transmissions from the surface of Ross 128B. The Colonial Defense Forces are making a final stand around New Birmingham, but they won't last more than a few hours." Reeves nodded grimly. He'd seen this pattern repeated across dozens of worlds. The Vorthak would arrive in overwhelming numbers, crush any orbital defenses, then begin the slow process of harvesting the planet's population. They never seemed to be in any hurry. Why should they be? They had all the time in the universe, and humanity was running out of places to run. "What's the status on our special passenger?" Reeves asked. "Secured in Cargo Bay 7, sir. The containment protocols are holding, but—" Walsh hesitated. "Sir, I have to say, the crew is extremely nervous about having that thing aboard. Some of the men are talking about spacing it before we reach the combat zone." Reeves understood their fear. He'd read the preliminary reports from Dr. Yates, watched the classified footage of Morrison's transformation when exposed to Vorthak biosignatures. The man was a weapon in human form, and weapons had a tendency to go off at unexpected times. But conventional weapons had failed against the Vorthak. Their bioarmor could absorb plasma fire. Their ships regenerated damage faster than human weapons could inflict it, and their warriors fought with the coordinated precision of a hive mind. Humanity needed something the Vorthak had never encountered before, something they couldn't predict or counter. "Maintain containment protocols until we reach the drop zone," Reeves ordered. "And Commander? If any of the crew tries to harm our passenger, they'll answer to me personally." The Retribution accelerated toward Ross 128B, slipping between the massive Vorthak bioships like a minnow swimming past whales. The alien vessels were focused on the planet below, their attention completely absorbed by the harvest in progress. They barely registered the single human transport as a threat. That oversight would soon prove costly. "Approaching drop coordinates," reported the helm officer. "The surface situation is not good, sir. New Birmingham is completely surrounded. The Vorthak have established harvesting stations throughout the city." Through the viewports, Reeves could see the lights of the burning colony spread across the planet's surface like infected wounds. Somewhere down there, the last few thousand humans on Ross 128b were fighting a hopeless battle against an enemy that viewed them as nothing more than raw materials. "Signal Cargo Bay 7, Reeves ordered. "Tell Morrison it's time." In the depths of the ship, James Morrison received the message with calm satisfaction. He'd spent the journey in meditation, focusing his enhanced mind on the task ahead. The genetic modifications had changed more than his body. His thoughts moved differently now, following paths of cold logic that would have horrified his former self. He could smell the Vorthak even through the ship's hull, their alien pheromones triggering responses in his modified nervous system. The sensation was intoxicating, like the scent of blood to a shark. Every instinct screamed at him to hunt, to kill, to tear the enemy apart with his bare hands, but Morrison retained enough of his original personality to maintain control. For now, the cargo bay doors opened with a hiss of pressurizing air. Morrison stepped into the corridor, and the crew members who saw him immediately pressed themselves against the walls. He didn't blame them for their fear. He could feel what he'd become radiating from him like heat from a forge. Even other humans registered him as a threat now, some primal part of their brain recognizing him as a predator. Morrison made his way to the drop bay where a single-man, atmospheric entry pod waited. The pod was little more than a reinforced capsule with basic guidance systems and emergency supplies. Morrison wouldn't need much equipment for what he was about to do. "Morrison," Admiral Reeves' voice crackled over the intercom. "Remember, your primary objective is to disrupt Vorthak operations around New Birmingham. Secondary objective is to gather intelligence on their harvesting procedures. Do not, under any circumstances, engage more enemies than you can handle. We need you alive to report back." Morrison almost smiled. Reeves still thought like a normal human, worried about tactical objectives and survival rates. Morrison had different concerns now. He wanted to hurt the Vorthak, to make them understand that humanity wasn't just another prey species to be harvested at their leisure. "Understood." "Admiral," Morrison replied, sealing himself into the drop pod. "Beginning descent in 30 seconds. The pod's engines fired, pushing Morrison away from the retribution and toward the planet below. As he descended through the atmosphere, he could see the Vorthak positions spread across New Birmingham like a cancer. Their bioconstructs dotted the landscape, pulsing structures that seemed to breathe and twitch with alien life. Morrison's drop pod hit the ground in a residential district, about 2 kilometers from the main Vorthak concentration. He emerged from the smoking crater to find himself in a ghost town of abandoned houses and empty streets. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of weapons fire and the inhuman singing of Vorthak. Harvesters. He began moving toward the sound, his enhanced senses processing information with superhuman clarity. He could hear human voices calling for help, smell the acrid stench of Vorthak bioweapons, feel the tremor of massive alien constructs moving through the city. Everything fed into the growing rage that the genetic modifications had built into his neural pathways. Morrison rounded a corner and saw his first Vorthak warrior. The alien stood 3 meters tall, its chitinous exoskeleton gleaming with organic lubricants. 4 arms ended in razor-sharp claws, and its head was a nightmare fusion of insect and crustacean features. It was dragging an unconscious human toward a nearby harvesting station, moving with the casual confidence of an apex predator. The moment Morrison caught sight of the creature, his careful control evaporated. The genetic triggers activated like a switch being thrown, flooding his system with combat hormones and wiping away every consideration except the need to destroy the enemy before him. Morrison moved with inhuman speed, crossing 30 meters in seconds. The Vorthak warrior detected his approach at the last moment, turning with its own supernatural reflexes to meet the threat. Its claws swept toward Morrison's head in an arc that would have decapitated a normal human. Morrison caught the creature's arm in mid-swing and twisted, feeling chitinous exoskeleton crack and splinter under his enhanced strength. The Vorthak's harmonious war song turned into a shriek of pain and surprise. It had never encountered a human who could match its physical capabilities. Morrison drove his free hand into the creature's thorax, his fingers punching through bio-armor like it was paper. He felt alien organs rupture under his grip, hot fluid spilling over his hands. The Vorthak warrior tried to bring its other arms to bear, but Morrison was already inside its guard. Too close for its weapons to be effective, he grabbed the creature's head and twisted sharply to the left. The sound of its neck breaking was like a tree branch snapping in half as the Vorthak corpse hit the ground. Morrison felt the combat hormones begin to recede. His enhanced mind immediately began processing what had just happened, analyzing his performance and planning his next move. The engagement had lasted less than 15 seconds. And he'd destroyed an enemy warrior that would have required a full squad of colonial marines to bring down, but more importantly, he'd enjoyed it. The genetic modifications hadn't just made him stronger and faster. They'd made him love violence in a way that his original personality would have found horrifying. Every broken bone, every ruptured organ, every moment of alien agony had filled him with satisfaction that bordered on ecstasy. Morrison looked down at the unconscious human the Vorthak had been dragging away. A young woman, probably a colonist who'd been caught when the aliens overran the city. She was alive, but for how much longer? He could hear more Vorthak warriors moving through the nearby streets, their harmonious songs echoing off the abandoned buildings. They would be here soon, drawn by their comrades' death cry. Morrison could retreat, report back to Admiral Reeves, complete his mission safely. Instead, he picked up the unconscious woman and carried her to a nearby building, setting her down in a place where she might have a chance of reaching safety when she woke up. Then he turned toward the sound of approaching enemies and felt his lips pull back in what might charitably be called a smile. The Vorthak wanted to harvest humanity. Morrison was about to teach them that some prey bites back. The first Vorthak patrol found Morrison 20 minutes later, standing in the middle of an intersection like he was waiting for a bus. 5 warriors approached in their standard hunting formation, their biosensors scanning him for threat indicators. What they detected confused them. The human registered as a single organism, minimal technological enhancements, no heavy weapons. By all their calculations, he should have been easy prey. They were catastrophically wrong. Morrison waited until they were within 10 meters before moving. The lead Vorthak warrior had just enough time to realize something was wrong before Morrison's fist caved in its chest cavity. The creature's harmonic death scream triggered an immediate aggressive response from its packmates. But they were already too late. Morrison flowed between them like water, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to anticipate their movements before they made them. He caught the second warrior's primary claw arm and used its own momentum to swing it into a nearby wall hard, enough to crack the building's foundation. The third warrior tried to back away and bring its bio-rifle to bear, but Morrison was already moving, crossing the distance in a single bound that carried him onto the creature's back. His fingers found the weak point where the Vorthak's neck met its thorax. One sharp twist, and another alien warrior went limp. The remaining 2 warriors attempted to coordinate their attack, but Morrison's enhanced combat instincts read their movements like a book. He rolled under the 4th warrior's sweeping claws and came up inside its guard, his elbow driving upward into what passed for the creature's solar plexus. As it doubled over, gasping for breath through its gill slits, Morrison grabbed its head and slammed it down onto his rising knee. The final warrior turned to flee, its survival instincts overriding the Vorthak Collective's programming. Morrison caught it after 3 steps, his fingers closing around its primary leg joint. He lifted the creature off the ground and spun it in a circle before releasing it into the side of an abandoned shop. The impact left a crater in the concrete wall and a very dead alien warrior, 5 Vorthak soldiers destroyed in less than 2 minutes. Morrison stood among the corpses, breathing heavily but feeling more alive than he had since the modifications began. This was what he'd been created for. This was his purpose, but the real test was just beginning. The death songs of 5 warriors simultaneously would have alerted every Vorthok unit in the immediate area. Morrison could already hear them coming, the harmonious tones of their communication growing louder as they converged on his position. Dozens of them, possibly hundreds. A normal human would have run. Morrison checked the street for the best tactical positions and started planning his defense. He didn't have to wait long. The first wave consisted of 12 warriors moving in a classic Vorthok sweep formation. Morrison let them enter the intersection before revealing himself. Stepping out from behind an overturned vehicle with his hands empty and his posture relaxed, the lead warrior raised its bio rifle, but Morrison was already moving. He crossed the open ground in a zigzag pattern that confused the Vorthok targeting systems, their weapons firing at spaces he'd already vacated. When he reached the formation, he didn't slow down. Morrison hit the lead warrior like a wrecking ball, driving them both into the creature behind it. All 3 went down in a tangle of limbs and chitinous armor. Morrison rolled clear and came up swinging, his fist connecting with another warrior's head hard enough to snap its neck. The remaining Vorthok tried to surround him, but Morrison used their own numbers against them. He stayed close to one warrior, using it as a shield while he systematically dismantled another. When the first creature finally collapsed from its injuries, Morrison grabbed its bio rifle and turned it on its former. Packmate's Vorthok weapons were designed to be fired by creatures with 4 arms and completely different neural pathways. Morrison made them work anyway, his enhanced nervous system adapting to the alien interface through pure trial and error. The bio-rifle's organic ammunition tore through Vorthok armor like it was made of tissue paper. When the weapon finally exhausted its ammunition, Morrison threw it aside and returned to hand-to-hand combat. By the time the dust settled, 12 more alien corpses littered the intersection. Morrison was just catching his breath when the second wave arrived. This time, the Vorthok had learned. Instead of warriors, they sent a harvester. The massive bioconstruct rounded the corner like a living building, its tentacles writhing with predatory hunger. Morrison had seen recordings of these creatures in action, watched them tear through entire platoons of colonial marines without taking significant damage. They were mobile fortresses, armed with bioweapons that could level city blocks and protected by armor that could shrug off anything short of orbital bombardment. Morrison looked up at the creature looming over him and felt his modified brain analyze the tactical situation. A normal human would have no chance against such a massive enemy. Even a squad of enhanced humans might struggle to bring down a harvester, but Morrison wasn't thinking like a normal human anymore. The genetic modifications had stripped away his capacity for fear and doubt, leaving only cold calculation and murderous intent. The harvester was big and heavily armored, but it was also slow and dependent on its biosensors to track threats. Morrison could work with that. He sprinted directly toward the creature, staying below its sensor range by hugging the ground. The harvester's main weapons couldn't depress far enough to target something moving at its feet, and its smaller defensive appendages were designed to deal with conventional weapons. Not a single human-shaped missile. Morrison reached the harvester's base and began climbing. His enhanced strength allowed him to dig his fingers directly into the creature's bio-armor, creating handholds where none had existed before. The harvester bucked and thrashed, trying to dislodge him, but Morrison held on like a tick. He climbed steadily upward, ignoring the smaller defensive tentacles that slapped at him like wet ropes. Most of their impacts he simply absorbed, his modified physiology shrugging off damage that would have crippled a normal human. When one particularly aggressive tentacle got too close, he grabbed it and tore it off at the root, eliciting a harmonic shriek of pain from the creature. Morrison reached the harvester's sensor cluster and began systematically destroying the bioorganic components. Without its sensors, the creature was essentially blind, reduced to flailing helplessly at an enemy it could no longer track. Morrison worked his way around to what he hoped was the creature's primary, nervous system and began digging. His hands punched through bio-armor and into the soft tissues beneath. He felt his fingers close around what might have been a major nerve cluster and squeezed. The harvester's movements became erratic, its harmonic shifting from aggression to what sounded almost like fear. Morrison found another nerve cluster and ripped it out entirely. Then another. He was rewiring the creature's nervous system through brute force, turning its own bioarchitecture against it. The harvester collapsed with a sound like a building falling down. Morrison rode it to the ground and rolled clear, coming up covered in alien blood but essentially unharmed. He looked around the intersection, taking in the carnage he'd created. 22 Vorthic corpses and 1 dead harvester, all destroyed by a single enhanced human in less than an hour. It was a level of tactical success that would have been impossible with conventional forces, but Morrison wasn't done. He could hear more Vorthak units moving through the city, their harmonic communications carrying notes of confusion and growing alarm. They'd never encountered resistance like this before. They didn't understand what they were facing. Morrison intended to educate them. He began moving deeper into the city, following the sound of Vorthak voices toward their main concentration. Behind him, the intersection looked like a slaughterhouse. Alien corpses scattered like broken toys, and somewhere in the distance, other enhanced humans were waking up in Dr. Yates' laboratory, ready to join the hunt. The Vorthic Collective had existed for over 10 million years, consuming civilizations across hundreds of galaxies. In all that time, they had never encountered a species that improved during the harvesting process. Every other race had followed the same predictable pattern: initial resistance, gradual demoralization, final collapse into despair and acceptance. Humans were different. Coordinator Vrextall monitored the situation on Ross 128 billion from his bioship in orbit. His consciousness linked directly to the planet's harvesting network. What he was seeing violated every protocol in the collective's vast database of conquest scenarios. A single human organism had eliminated 47 warriors and 3 harvesters in the span of 6 hours. The losses were acceptable, but the implications were not. The human was learning. Each engagement showed tactical improvements over the last. The creature was adapting to Vorthic combat methods with frightening speed, developing counter-strategies that exploited weaknesses in bio-armor design and formation tactics. More disturbing still, it seemed to be actively enjoying the combat, displaying behavioral patterns that the collective xenopsychologists couldn't classify. Analysis, Vrextall commanded, his thoughts rippling through the bioship's nervous system. The organism displays enhanced physical capabilities consistent with genetic modification, responded the ship's analytical cluster. Muscle density is approximately 300% of baseline human norms. Nervous system response time is accelerated beyond theoretical maximums. Pain tolerance approaches complete suppression. Psychological profile inconclusive. The organism shows no fear response to superior forces. Aggressive patterns suggest complete lack of self-preservation instinct when engaging collective units. Recommend immediate orbital bombardment of target area. Vrextall considered the recommendation. Orbital bombardment was standard procedure for dealing with anomalous resistance, but the human population on Ross 128 billion still represented significant biomass potential. The collective preferred to preserve as much raw material as possible during harvesting operations. More importantly, if the humans had developed enhancement technology, the collective needed to understand it. This could represent a new form of resistance that might spread to other human worlds. Better to study the anomaly now than face similar enhanced organisms across the entire human sphere. Negative. Deploy additional harvesting units to contain the organism. Capture if possible for analysis, acknowledged. On the planet's surface, Morrison felt the shift in Vorthak tactics immediately. Instead of the scattered patrols he'd been hunting, larger forces were moving to surround him. Their harmonic communications had changed pitch, becoming more urgent and coordinated. They were taking him seriously now. Good. Morrison preferred a challenge. He'd worked his way into the heart of New Birmingham, where the Vorthak had established their primary harvesting facility. The alien bioconstruct sprawled across what had once been the city's central plaza, a writhing mass of organic technology that pulsed with its own internal rhythms. Morrison could see human prisoners being processed through its various chambers, their life essence extracted to fuel the collective's expansion. The sight triggered another surge of genetically programmed rage. Morrison forced himself to remain calm and analyze the situation tactically. The harvesting facility was too large for him to destroy alone, but he could disrupt its operation significantly. More importantly, he could free some of the prisoners in the process. Morrison began his approach from the east, using the rubble of destroyed buildings to mask his movement. The Vorthak had posted sentries around the facility's perimeter, but their biosensors were calibrated to detect normal human signatures. Morrison's enhanced physiology registered as something else entirely. Allowing him to get much closer than they expected, he reached the facility's outer wall and began climbing, his enhanced strength allowing him to scale the bioorganic surface like a spider. The wall's living tissue tried to respond to his presence, defensive systems activating to repel what it perceived as a parasite. Morrison ignored the mild electric shocks and chemical burns, his modified pain tolerance rendering them insignificant. At the top of the wall, Morrison could see into the facility's interior. Dozens of human prisoners were suspended in biomechanical harvesting pods, their bodies slowly being drained of everything the collective found useful. The process would take hours to complete, leaving the victims conscious and aware throughout their gradual dissolution. Morrison dropped into the facility and began his work. The first Vorthak guard never knew what hit it. Morrison's enhanced speed allowed him to cross 20 meters of open ground before the creature could raise an alarm. A single blow to its primary nerve cluster dropped it silently. Morrison worked his way through the facility methodically, killing guards and destroying harvesting equipment with equal efficiency. His enhanced senses allowed him to track multiple Vorthak signatures simultaneously, picking off isolated enemies while avoiding larger groups. When he couldn't avoid detection, he used the facility's own architecture against his pursuers, leading them into cramped spaces where their size and numbers worked against them. By the time the alarm was raised, Morrison had freed 17 human prisoners and destroyed 6 harvesting units. The facility's bio-neural network was screaming warnings to every Vorthak unit within 10 kilometers. Morrison gathered the rescued prisoners in a defensive position near the facility's main entrance. Most were too weak to move under their own power, traumatized by their ordeal and suffering from the early stages of bio-extraction. But a few were still capable of basic coordination. "Can you use weapons?" Morrison asked a former colonial marine who'd retained more strength than the others. Sergeant Hayes nodded weakly. "Give me something to shoot, and I'll make it count." Morrison handed him a captured Vorthak bio-rifle. "The interface is organic. You have to make neural contact with the targeting system. It hurts, but it works." Hayes examined the alien weapon with professional interest. "What about you? You're not staying?" "I'm going back in," Morrison replied. "There are more prisoners in the deep sections. I can't get them all out, but I can make sure the Vorthak pay for what they've done." As if summoned by his words, the first wave of Vorthak reinforcements arrived. 50 warriors moved in perfect synchronization, their harmonic communications creating a web of tactical coordination that would have overwhelmed any conventional force. Morrison stood to meet them, and for the first time since his enhancement, he felt something approaching satisfaction. This was what the genetic modifications had been designed for. This moment when humanity's oldest and darkest instincts could finally be unleashed against an enemy that deserved no mercy. The Vorthak opened fire as they advanced, their bioweapons filling the air with organic projectiles that could punch through tank armor. Morrison moved between the incoming rounds like he was dancing, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to dodge fire that should have been impossible to avoid. He reached the Vorthak formation and disappeared into it like a wolf among sheep. What followed couldn't properly be called a battle. It was a massacre, a systematic destruction of alien life by a creature that had been genetically programmed for exactly this purpose. Morrison moved through the Vorthak ranks with inhuman grace, killing with precision and efficiency that bordered on artistry. When the last alien warrior fell, Morrison stood among the corpses, breathing hard but uninjured. Behind him, the rescued prisoners watched with expressions of awe and terror. They'd seen what human enhancement could accomplish, but they'd also seen what it had cost. Morrison looked human, but there was something in his eyes that belonged to no civilized species. "Get moving," Morrison told them. "Head for the spaceport. There should be evacuation shuttles still operational." "What about you?" Hayes asked. Morrison looked back at the harvesting facility, where dozens more human prisoners waited in biomechanical pods. In the distance, he could hear more Vorthak units converging on their position. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands. Even with his enhancements, the odds were becoming impossible. Morrison smiled, and Hayes involuntarily took a step backward. There was nothing human in that expression, nothing that suggested mercy or restraint or any of the qualities that separated civilization from savagery. "I have work to finish," Morrison said, and turned back toward the facility behind him. The rescued prisoners began their desperate journey to the spaceport. Ahead of him, the Vorthak prepared for their first encounter with weaponized, human hatred. Neither side fully understood what they had unleashed. Admiral Reeves received the first reports from Ross 128B with a mixture of elation and growing dread. Morrison's mission had exceeded every projection. In 8 hours, a single enhanced human had eliminated over 300 Vorthak warriors, destroyed 2 major harvesting facilities, and rescued 47 prisoners. By any conventional metric, it was the greatest tactical victory in the war against the collective. But the follow-up reports painted a more disturbing picture. "Sir," Commander Walsh said quietly, "we're receiving testimonies from the evacuated prisoners." Morrison's performance was exceptional, but his behavior toward the end was concerning. Reeves studied the classified debriefs on his personal display. Sergeant Hayes had reported that Morrison showed no interest in extraction or survival, seeming focused only on killing as many Vorthak as possible. Other witnesses described him laughing during combat, taking unnecessary risks to prolong engagements rather than ending them efficiently. Any word from Morrison himself? "Negative, sir. His last transmission was 14 hours ago. Planetary surveillance shows Vorthak forces withdrawing from New Birmingham entirely. They appear to be establishing a containment perimeter around the entire urban area." That was unprecedented. The Vorthak had never abandoned a harvesting site once they'd established operations. For them to pull back suggested they'd encountered something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the conquest process. "What's the status on the other Lazarus subjects?" Walsh consulted his secondary display. "Dr. Yates reports that 36 additional subjects have completed modification. She's requesting deployment authorizations for immediate combat operations." He paused. "Sir, she also reports some concerning behavioral patterns in the new subjects. They're becoming increasingly aggressive toward normal humans. 3 incidents of violence during routine medical examinations." Reeves closed his eyes. The reports from Europa had warned about this. The genetic modifications that made subjects effective against the Vorthak also suppressed their capacity for normal social interaction. Enhanced humans saw regular humans as weak, potentially even as prey. Project Lazarus wasn't just creating super soldiers. It was creating a new subspecies that might be inherently hostile to baseline humanity. "Sir," Walsh continued, "we're also receiving reports from other fronts. The Vorthak have begun altering their tactics across all active theaters. They're withdrawing from direct ground engagements and shifting to orbital bombardment protocols. It's like they're afraid of something." They were learning, Reeves realized. The collective was adapting to the threat that enhanced humans represented, just as they'd adapted to every other form of resistance over their millions of years of conquest. But in adapting, they were revealing something important. They could be intimidated. The Vorthak weren't invincible. They could feel fear. "Authorized deployment of 12 Lazarus subjects to the Proxima Centauri theater," Reeves decided. Full combat operations, maximum disruption of Vorthak harvesting activities. And Commander? Make sure each unit is equipped with neural inhibitor devices. If they start showing signs of excessive aggression toward human populations, we need to be able to shut them down. Walsh nodded grimly. Acknowledged, sir. And Morrison? Reeves looked at the tactical display showing Ross 128b. The planet's surface was dotted with impact craters where the Vorthak had attempted orbital bombardment of Morrison's last known position. Each strike had failed to eliminate the target, suggesting either exceptional luck or tactical abilities that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Morrison is now classified as a strategic asset operating behind enemy lines, Reeves said finally. We maintain surveillance but do not attempt extraction unless he specifically requests it. What he didn't say, what couldn't be included in any official report, was that Morrison might already be beyond extraction. The psychological profile suggested that prolonged combat exposure would eventually overwhelm the subject's remaining human personality traits. Morrison wasn't just fighting the Vorthak anymore. He was becoming something that existed purely to destroy them on the surface of Ross 128b. Morrison crouched in the ruins of what had once been a shopping complex, listening to the harmonic communications of the Vorthak forces surrounding his position. They'd pulled back to a 5-kilometer perimeter, apparently content to contain rather than confront him directly. The strategy showed wisdom, but it also showed fear. Morrison found their fear intoxicating. For the past 6 hours, he'd been conducting a systematic campaign of terror against the Vorthak containment forces. He would strike at an isolated position, eliminate the defenders, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Each attack was designed not just to inflict casualties, but to create psychological pressure on the survivors. The Vorthak were discovering that being hunted was a very different experience from being the hunters. Morrison's enhanced senses detected movement to the northwest. A patrol of 8 warriors moving in standard formation but with obvious nervousness in their biosignatures. Their harmonic communications carried undertones of stress that Morrison's modified brain interpreted as easily as reading text. He began stalking them. The enhancement process had stripped away most of Morrison's capacity for complex emotional responses, but it had left his tactical intelligence intact and enhanced. He understood that pure aggression wasn't enough. The Vorthak needed to be taught that humans could be as methodical and merciless as they were. Terror was a weapon, and Morrison intended to use it. He followed the patrol for 20 minutes, staying just beyond their sensor range, learning their patterns and identifying their weaknesses. The lead warrior favored its left side, probably compensating for an old injury. The rear guard showed signs of fatigue, its movements slightly less coordinated than the others. When Morrison finally attacked, it was with surgical precision. He dropped from an overhanging structure onto the rear guard, breaking its neck before it could raise an alarm. The warrior simply collapsed, its bio-rifle clattering to the ground. Morrison was already moving, using the falling body to mask his approach to the next target. The second warrior died with Morrison's fingers through its primary nerve cluster. The third turned to face him and managed to get off a single shot before Morrison's fist caved in its thorax. The bioweapon's organic projectile missed by centimeters, close enough for Morrison to feel the heat of its passage. By now, the remaining 5 warriors were aware of his presence, but their confusion worked in his favor. They'd been trained to fight organized resistance. Not a single predator that moved like smoke and killed like lightning. Morrison eliminated 2 more before they could effectively coordinate their response. When the survivors finally managed to establish a defensive formation, Morrison simply vanished into the rubble, leaving 5 corpses and 3 thoroughly terrified alien warriors. He followed them as they retreated to their main position, radioing frantic reports in harmonic codes that his enhanced brain was beginning to decode. They were calling him the Shadow Death in their communications, a designation that carried notes of religious terror in the collective's linguistic structure. Morrison found their fear almost as satisfying as their deaths. As night fell over Ross 128b, Morrison continued his campaign of calculated terror. He struck at supply convoys, eliminated isolated sentries, and conducted hit-and-run attacks that kept the entire Vorthak force in a state of constant alert. Each engagement was designed to maximize psychological impact. While minimizing his own exposure to counterattack, the Vorthak were learning to fear the dark, but Morrison was learning too. Each engagement taught him more about Vorthak psychology, tactics, and weaknesses. He was beginning to understand how their hive-mind communication worked, how their biotechnology operated, how their hierarchical command structure functioned, more importantly. He was beginning to understand how to hurt them in ways that went beyond simple physical destruction. The Vorthak Collective was built on assumptions about their own superiority and invulnerability. Morrison was systematically destroying those assumptions, one dead warrior at a time, somewhere in the ruins of New Birmingham. Concealed beneath tons of rubble and biomechanical wreckage, Morrison had established a base of operations. The chamber was decorated with trophies from his kills, Vorthak bio-armor arranged in complex patterns, alien weapons modified for human use, communication devices that allowed him to monitor enemy transmissions. Morrison sat in the center of his trophy chamber, surrounded by the instruments of death he'd claimed from his enemies. His enhanced senses detected the approach of dawn, and with it, new opportunities for violence. The Vorthak would send fresh patrols to replace the ones he'd eliminated during the night. More targets for his particular form of education. He closed his eyes and let his modified nervous system process the harmonic communications flowing through the Vorthak network. Their fear was growing stronger, spreading through their ranks like a virus. They were beginning to understand that they'd encountered something unprecedented. In their millions of years of conquest, they'd found a species that got stronger when cornered, more dangerous when threatened, more deadly when desperate. Morrison smiled in the darkness of his trophy chamber. 6 months after Morrison's deployment to Ross 128B, the war against the Vorthak Collective had transformed into something unrecognizable. Across 12 star systems, enhanced humans conducted operations that redefined the meaning of asymmetric warfare. The Vorthak, for the first time in their species' history, were retreating. Dr. Elena Yates stood before the UN War Council in the secure briefing chamber beneath Luna City, her hands shaking as she presented her final report on Project Lazarus. The holographic displays around her showed tactical maps dotted with red zones where enhanced humans operated, areas that Vorthak forces now avoided entirely. The tactical effectiveness of the Lazarus subjects exceeds all projections, she reported, her voice carefully controlled. Enhanced human units have eliminated over 15,000 Vorthak warriors and destroyed 47 major bioconstructs. Harvesting operations have been suspended across 8 occupied worlds. Council President Martinez leaned forward in his chair. That sounds like unqualified success, Doctor. Why do you look like you're delivering a death sentence? Elena activated another holographic display, this one showing psychological profiles of the active Lazarus subjects. The data painted a disturbing picture of progressive dehumanization, increasing aggression toward baseline humans, and complete loss of empathy for anything they didn't perceive as useful to their mission. The enhancement process has proven irreversible, Elena continued. The subjects retain tactical intelligence and basic communication skills, but they're becoming increasingly isolated from normal human psychology. We've lost contact with 14 units who appear to have gone completely rogue. Define rogue, demanded General Harrison from his position at the council table. Elena hesitated, then activated a classified recording from Proxima Centauri B. The footage showed enhanced unit 7 systematically executing Vorthak prisoners. Not in the heat of battle, but during organized interrogation sessions. The subject showed no emotion as it tortured information from captured aliens, treating their suffering as a purely tactical resource. They're not just killing the enemy, Elena explained. They're learning to enjoy it. The genetic modifications we introduced have awakened something in human psychology that we don't fully understand. Something that may be incompatible with civilized behavior? Admiral Reeves, participating via quantum link from his flagship, addressed the council directly. With respect, Dr. Yates, civilized behavior is what got us into this mess. The Vorthak have spent millions of years perfecting the art of genocide. Maybe we needed to become monsters to fight them effectively. Elena turned to face Reeves' holographic image. Admiral, Enhanced Unit 12 attacked a refugee convoy last week. They perceived the evacuation ships as tactically inefficient and attempted to conscript the passengers for combat operations. We had to deploy a full Marine company to subdue them. The council chamber fell silent. The implications were staggering. Humanity had created a weapon that could defeat the Vorthak, but that same weapon was beginning to turn on its creators. The enhanced humans were evolving beyond their original programming, becoming something that existed purely for warfare. "What about Morrison?" Martinez asked quietly. "The original subject. What's his current status?" Elena's expression grew even more troubled. "Morrison has been operating on Ross 128b for 6 months without resupply or external support. Vorthak forces have completely abandoned the planet rather than continue engaging him. We've intercepted communications suggesting that the Collective has classified him as a apex extinction event and implemented containment protocols to prevent his spread to other worlds." She activated another display showing orbital surveillance footage from Ross 128b. The planet's surface was scarred with impact craters from failed Vorthak bombardment attempts, but thermal scans still detected a single human signature moving through the ruins of New Birmingham. Morrison was not just surviving. He was thriving in an environment that would kill any normal human within hours. "The Vorthak are more afraid of Morrison than he is of them," Elena continued. "They've begun modifying their entire tactical doctrine to account for the possibility of enhanced human contact. Fleet deployments now include specific protocols for dealing with what they call viral human contamination. General Harrison studied the tactical data with professional interest. So we've created a weapon that the enemy considers more dangerous than their own extinction-level technologies." "That sounds like exactly what we needed. At what cost?" Elena demanded. "Morrison hasn't responded to communication attempts in 3 months. Enhanced Units 3, 7, and 15 have attacked civilian targets. Unit 22 attempted to modify other humans using captured Vorthak biotechnology. We're not creating super soldiers anymore. We're creating a new species that views baseline humanity as obsolete." The debate continued for hours, but the outcome was predetermined. The war against the Vorthak was still being lost on most fronts, despite the successes of the enhanced humans. Conventional forces remained inadequate against collective technology, and diplomatic solutions were impossible with a species that viewed all other life as raw material. Project Lazarus would continue, with enhanced oversight and modified protocols. More volunteers would be processed, despite the psychological risks. Humanity would fight monsters by becoming monsters, because the alternative was extinction. But on Ross 128b, something was happening that the War Council couldn't predict or control. Morrison stood in the central chamber of what had once been the Vorthak primary harvesting facility, now converted into his base of operations. The alien biotechnology had been extensively modified, rewired to respond to human neural patterns rather than collective commands. Morrison had learned to interface directly with Vorthak systems, turning their own tools against them, but more importantly, he'd learned to reproduce the enhancement process. The chamber contained 12 biomodification pods, each one a hybrid of human and Vorthak technology. Inside the pods, human survivors from Ross 128b underwent the same genetic modifications that had transformed Morrison, but with improvements based on his 6 months of combat experience. Morrison had become more than just an enhanced human. He'd become the architect of humanity's next evolutionary step. "Status report," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that resembled Vorthak communication protocols. "All subjects are responding well to the modification process," reported Sarah Chun from her monitoring station. The former Colonial Defense Force captain had been one of the first survivors to volunteer for Morrison's enhancement program. Neural pathway reconstruction is proceeding within acceptable parameters. Physical modifications should be complete within 6 hours. Morrison nodded, studying the readouts from each pod. His enhanced intellect had solved the psychological instability problems that plagued Dr. Yates' original subjects. The new modifications included genetic sequences that preserved human emotional capacity while still providing the enhanced aggression necessary for fighting the Vorthek. "Prepare for deployment," Morrison ordered. "The collective has established a new harvesting site on Kepler 442b. We'll need to eliminate their forces before they can complete the population extraction." Jean smiled, and Morrison noted with satisfaction that her expression contained both human warmth and something darker, more predatory. The new enhancement process was producing exactly the results he'd intended. Humans who retained their essential humanity while gaining the capacity for absolute violence when necessary. In the distance, Vorthok scout ships maintained their orbital surveillance, monitoring the planet they no longer dared to approach. Their communications carried notes of growing desperation as they reported Morrison's activities to the collective leadership. The Vorthok had made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that by applying sufficient pressure they could break human resistance and force the species into submission. Instead, they'd triggered an evolutionary response that was transforming their prey into something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Morrison activated the facility's communication array and transmitted a message on the standard colonial defense frequency. "This is Enhanced Unit 1 to all human military commands. Ross 128B has been secured and converted into a production facility for next-generation enhanced humans. We are prepared to begin large-scale operations against Vorthok targets throughout this sector." He paused, considering how much to reveal about his modifications to the original enhancement process. The War Council would want to maintain control over Project Lazarus, but Morrison had moved beyond their authority. He was no longer taking orders from baseline humans who couldn't understand the scope of the conflict. "Be advised," Morrison continued, "that enhanced human units are now capable of self-replication and tactical independence. We no longer require support from conventional forces for mission completion." Morrison out. The message would reach Earth in 6 hours, where it would trigger debates about the future of human evolution and the price of victory against the Vorthok collective. But Morrison wasn't interested in debates. He had work to do. The galaxy was vast, and the Vorthok had harvested thousands of worlds. But now humanity had something the collective had never faced in their millions of years of conquest: a species